we go. They call me Mr. Technology for a reason. Okay, one more click and we're in. Very good. So as Tony mentioned, I wear a number of hats, but one of them is working under contract with Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is a gift and an honor, I have to say. It's something I wanted to do since I was very young, but either didn't have the chops for or was a little too afraid to approach until I got older. But I've been working with them for about 7 years now, I guess. And it's interesting because it's NASA, but it's run by Caltech. And so nobody there is a civil servant. So hiring practices are a little different than they might be for some of you that worked at another NASA field center. And a lot of us are contractors that come on for 6 or 8 months, and then we're furloughed for 6 to 4 months, and then we're back. The interesting part I find about that is no matter how many times you would badge for JPL, and I've probably been badged there 5 times, and badging at a NASA facility is a big deal because of Homeland Security and all that. No matter how many times you do it, if you start the job in, let's say, January, you'll probably end up getting your badge in June or July. And then I'm usually done by August or September. So I get to have my badge for a couple of months, and then they take it away from you until they do it again next year. So it makes it very interesting. But be that as it may. Oops, let's see here. Okay. So as Tony mentioned, I've written a number of books, not quite 400, about, I think this was number 18 this year with JPL. A couple were about World War II, all the rest have been about the American space program, either history or policy or forward looking. And publishing is an interesting business these days. When I don't know how many of you have written books or thought about writing books, but when I started back in 2005, the advance the publisher gave you to write the book, the money up front they gave you, on average for a first-time author, was between $30,000 and $40,000. So if you wrote 2 or 3 books a year, you could even live in Southern California if you were crazy enough to do so. Nowadays, because of Amazon and the changes in the publishing business, which Tony's very well of since he does publishing, multiple published authors are lucky to get 10,000, which is still sounds like a lot. If you're new, you're often offered between 0 and 2,000. But if you're talking about a year of work, it's not quite enough, which is why we wear many hats. So I wear many hats. One of them is being a book author. Another is being the editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine. Aggie Coburn, who you may see also joining us today, is the publication director. This is our latest cover, and I only put this in here because I wanted to show it off. You probably haven't gotten the magazine yet. It just mailed. But we were doing 2 stories on the Chinese space program, and I thought I want something kind of mysterious. So if you can see it on your screen.
Hey, Rod.
Yes, sir.
We're still stuck on the first screen.
Really?
Yes.
Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, it looks like we're on the preview mode. You may just have to flip your monitors.
Yeah, you might flip your monitor or something.
Mode.
Oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. How do I change that?
Unpause it.
I'm pushing every button I got. It's just moving the dock around. Huh. Let me stop sharing and try again. Sorry about the delays, guys.
It's okay. We're an informal group here. So there we go.
There we go. Okay. There's Ad Astra. So if you look closely at the visor there, you'll see a Chinese flag next to that taikonaut who's saluting. So besides being kind of interesting and controversial, and this is by Jim Vaughn, our usual cover illustrator, I thought this is kind of fun because you don't know which one of them got there first, right? Was the American standing there? He's got a little Artemis patch that you can barely see. Was the American standing there when the Chinese walked up and planted their flag, or vice versa? So we'll see. You know, that's the big open question, I think, for this decade. So as part of my yearly income profile, as I said, I do my JPL contract. So today we'll be talking about what's new at JPL. This is a book they do every year with the lyrical name of Technology Highlights, and it's about 80 pages. And we assemble between 30 and 35 of the coolest new tech projects that either started or were underway that year. So this one's for 2021. And we profile them. And it's an interesting process because, you know, it's a very graphically driven book. So I'm going to these principal investigators and chief engineers who have been working on this project for, 5, 7, 10 years and saying, hi, my name's Rod. I'm writing this book. We worked together last year. I've got 400 words to tell your story. And you get kind of a long, sad look. And as we get to talking, some of them are fine, but a lot of them, if you know engineers or are an engineer, you'll understand this. You see their hands start quivering because they're reaching for their dry marker to start drawing your graphs on that whiteboard behind them. And I have to say, no, you have to use your words. This is like a long tweet of what you've been doing for the last however many years. But it's a fun process. The book's audience is primarily NASA headquarters. Secondarily, it goes to Congress and the executive branch. Then finally, it's posted online for the public. So it's kind of an interesting combination of breezy read and hard technology. So my job is to take the journal articles or the stories written within the lab and try and put them in layperson's vernacular, which when you're dealing with Congress can be a challenge because you get everything from soup to nuts in Congress in terms of awareness of technology and levels of understanding of engineering and science and so forth. So it's been an interesting challenge, but I really enjoy doing it. So a little bit about JPL. It was founded back in the 1930s. Originally, it was just a number of Caltech grad students that were experimenting with rocketry. And after a couple of explosions on the Caltech campus in the middle of Pasadena, the administration there decided this isn't such a good idea. Let's move these guys. So they set up shop down in the Arroyo Seco, which is literally a little dry gulch on the west end of Pasadena. It had two great advantages. One, there was nobody living in it. And two, it had valley sides on it. So if your rocket engine exploded, the shrapnel just went into the rocks. So if you lost a couple of grad students, anybody who's been a professor before knows that grad students are generally regarded as cannon fodder. So there you go. It's a good way to do business. By the 1940s, they were working with the U.S. Army, and their principal original work was building jet-assisted takeoff engines, which is how they got the name Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which isn't really appropriate anymore, but it's stuck. One of their keynote moments was orbiting the first U.S. satellite in January of 1958. As you'll recall, Sputnik, the Soviet Union orbited Sputnik in 1957. And we had been scrambling to try and get our own satellite up for the International Geophysical Year called Vanguard, which was a civilian program working with the U.S. Navy. Vanguard exploded spectacularly on public news feeds in late 1957. And JPL and Werner von Braun were approached to get something up within a couple of months and managed to do so, which was nothing short of a miracle. And it was actually much more capable and lasted longer than Sputnik. Sputnik basically just transmitted a radio beep and its battery temperature. Explorer 1, which was the JPL satellite, JPL NASA satellite, actually discovered the Van Allen belts and did a lot of other notable research for a number of years. So great success there. By the 1960s, it was a full-on NASA field center. And that's really when they got their teeth into robotic space exploration. So there was a number of lunar missions. They kind of cut their teeth on the Ranger missions to the moon, which were a series of probes that were impactors. So they just headed directly for the lunar surface and took pictures as they got closer and closer. So by the time they were down to moments before impact, you were seeing rocks about the size of a dinner plate. So while it seems kind of a brute force methodology, it worked. However, I think they did 9 Rangers and only the last half worked. So it was a big challenge. Also handled the majority of the work on the surveyor flights also to the moon. And at that point, we're doing flybys of Mars and Venus with the Mariners. In the 1970s and 80s, they started working the outer solar system with the Voyagers and the Pioneer probes. And you probably know the history on from there. There's about 6,000 to 9,000 employees if you include contractors like me. Interestingly, though, everybody at JPL works for Caltech. So because of the relationship that JPL originally had with Caltech, even though it's a NASA field center, you get your paycheck and your benefits from Caltech. The downside is you're not a civil servant, so you don't get all those bennies and there's no pension program. The upside is you're working for Caltech. So it's a little more laid back and academically run than you would expect for a NASA field center. And for the kind of things that people do at JPL, that's kind of an advantage, because it really is kind of an intense research environment. So if you ever get a chance to visit, I highly recommend it. They only open it to the public a couple of days a year, unfortunately. They're one of the few field centers without a museum, which is something that's been talked about for decades. But they do have an open house. Tickets go quick, but if you ever get a chance to go there, it's a sensational show. So here's a picture on the left of JPL nestled up in the foothills above Pasadena, and a picture on the right. I think this is from the 70s, telling us that, hey, if you're a geek like me, come work at JPL. So, and back then, that's what most of the people at JPL look like. Fortunately, that's changed, and it's a much more diverse environment now. Just one more historical note about the kind of people, the way they think at JPL. So this is a photograph from about 1965. When Mariner 4 flew past Mars, it took 22.5 low resolution black and white images that were actually taken by a Vidicon tube, television tube, and then digitized and sent back to Earth. And it took, I think, 6 hours to get each image at 200 pixels. So a little slower than we're used to now. But they came in as numbers, and it was going to take a couple of days for the JPL Photo Lab. Sorry, something just popped up here. I have to give. Oh, it's reminding me that I have a talk for Tony. It came in as digital values. So the scientists on the mission, planetary scientists on the mission, just couldn't wait to see what was coming in. So they cut up the paper into strips and taped them up on the wall and ran down to the local art store and got some chalk and drew in this image of the first photo to come back from Mars, which actually turned out to be pretty accurate. The ones that did finally come in were processed and printed in black and white. These guys were able to approximate the values. Interestingly, when they went to the art store, it's a very small art store in downtown Pasadena, they only had 2 colors of chalk. And they said, okay, we got green and blue or red and yellow. And fortunately, they went for red and yellow, because green and blue would have been kind of weird. So getting on to this year's book, this is our cover. We always try to do a graphically dramatic cover. And you can see by the NASA logo there, they had to tweak the color a bit to bring out the detail. But this is a simulation of an ice crystal from Enceladus, Saturn's moon, hitting a collection scoop on an orbiting probe. And the little colored area you see in the left there with the circle around it is a biomolecule of some kind, we hope. Again, this is a simulation, but this is the best illustration I've got of it, which is why I wanted to put the cover up front, because we didn't have many illustrations of the book, but this is the cover story. So the need, and I thought I'd identify each of the few missions I'm going to cover with needs. I'm only going to have time to go through 4 or 5 of them. The need is to gather samples from the plumes of Enceladus. So as you know, there are plumes of ice particles, water, but once it hits the vacuum of space, it becomes ice particle showers coming out of cracks in the surface of Enceladus, which is an icy moon of Saturn that has a what we think is a warm ocean below. So if you want to investigate for life on that body, you have a couple of choices. You can land and try and scrape up some of the ice deposits from the surface, or you can land and try and drill or melt your way down to the ocean, which is a huge engineering challenge. Or you can scoop up, we think, samples of these plumes from orbit and evaluate them on board the spacecraft. And Cassini mission at one point was rerouted to kind of give this a test. And it didn't have the right equipment to do a thorough evaluation, but it was a good engineering demonstration that at least it works in concept. But it turns out when you really start investigating this, there are some challenges to gathering samples from orbit. You're scooping at orbital velocity, and this isn't water that you're scooping up. These are ice crystals. So what happens to an ice crystal when it hits a scoop at orbital velocity? And orbital velocity, of course, is different there because the moons are much smaller than Earth. The reason you want to be able to collect these things somewhat delicately is because biomolecules may be present in the ice crystals, and you want to be able to see them. So as these ice crystals come into the scoop and impact the inside of the scoop, the metal scoop itself, they can vaporize as quickly as a femtosecond. And I was going to put all the zeros in there, but it's very short. And at that moment, if you do it right, the biomolecules ionize, and then you can sense them. You don't have to see them. You can just sense the fact that they're ionized, and that helps for detection. The problem is, if you're gathering them too quickly, the crystals can fragment, destroying the biomolecule. If you're collecting them too slowly, the biomolecules may not ionize successfully, and then you've lost your observation. So this research project was all about developing software to determine the sweet spot for the speed of the impacts. There we go. And that turns out, for anybody who's curious, to be 1.8 to 3.7 miles per second. So while this seems like kind of an abstract mental exercise, at the end of the day, if you can adjust your orbital speed and altitude properly to be low enough to pick up these particles, but high enough to be going within these two speeds, this range of speeds, you should be able to detect any organic or biomolecules present inside that ice crystal. So we had a lot of contestants for the cover story. And of course, it's not my decision. There's a whole chain of people above me that agonize over these things. And it got to be a little contentious. I think the other one was a starshade coronagraph telescope, which uses a starshade co-orbiting a distance from the aperture of the telescope to block out stars so that you can see exoplanets. And I forget what the third one was, but the Signs of Life in an Icy Veil won the day. Lovely dramatic title. So our next story I like to call To Boldly Rove, stealing from Star Trek there. What's the need here? Well, the need is for smaller, cheaper rovers to explore the dark and scary places on Mars and the Moon. As you know, the big rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance are flagship missions. They're very expensive, in the billions. They're big, they're heavy, they're valuable, and they're constrained by those factors to what they can do. There are things you don't want to do with rovers this size because they're big and heavy. You don't want to go into a sand trap and get stuck there like Spirit did in 2007. You don't want to go over a cliff. You don't want to go up or down too extreme a slope. So the sad truth is, while they're doing great work and making a lot of really incredible discoveries, you're kind of limited to doing the boring stuff, right? So the geologists are constantly wanting to wander off in dangerous territory, but the engineers are saying, no, stay on the flat and don't go in that crater over there, and don't go over any rocks that are too sharp because we don't want to tear up the wheels like we did on Curiosity. So what might be a good example, or a good solution for this problem, is smaller, cheaper rovers. So here you can see a small rover. It's about, I think about 10 inches across. It's doing its tricks in the Mars yard. And the idea is that you have a number of these smaller machines riding piggyback on the large rovers. So when you see something interesting or cool, but potentially risky, like a sand field or a crevice or possibly a cave or a pit or an extreme slope, you could send these smaller rovers in. And if you lose one or two of them, it's okay because you have a whole bunch of them to work with and they didn't cost you much. So one of them that is a really fun program is called Puffer. And this was actually developed by a grad student at UC Berkeley back in about 2011, 2012. Here's three puffers driving around in Mojave Desert, looking very much like little Civil War cannons. And as I said, they're very small, they're very simple. They carry minimal instrumentation. Ultimately, they'll carry cameras and a spectrometer and possibly one or two other instruments, but they'll keep them pretty light and pretty simple. The earliest version of this, which is still, I think, being developed, is called, they nickname it the Origami Rover, because it's foldable. So if you look up on the left there, you'll see two bits of patchwork panels that look like a transformer robot, but they're actually the fabric circuit board that the electronics are printed onto. And then the lower two illustrations show how the wheels fold up. In the third illustration at the top on the left, how the wheels fold down for stowage, and then through articulators they fold out and lock, so the final configuration is what you see on the right there. So you can stack a bunch of these in the back of the rover in little racks. And when you see something you want to go investigate, it's almost like launching depth charges off the back of a World War II submarine. They just pop out. Doesn't matter how they land. They right themselves instantly when they unfold. Here's one of the smaller versions next to a quarter. So you can see they're not very large. And if you have enough of them, you can operate them in collaborative fleets. So part of the newest work has been to add AI to this. So you're not having to joystick them from Earth. You can actually have a small fleet of these things operating across a range of interest, and they're talking to each other and sharing data and learning as they go and navigating somewhat autonomously. So for the illustrations here, 1 through 4, when you get to illustration 3, you're seeing that the rover can actually unlatch itself once it's been deployed, get flat again, and sort of, they look like little tarantulas crawling around. It can sort of skitter up inside a cave or a crevice and go into very small areas, do its investigation. So if you've got something that's only, say, 6 inches high, you can still scooch in there. You couldn't even get the robotic arm of the big rover in there because the instrument cluster on the end of that is probably 18 inches to 2 feet across. So really quite an ingenious idea and very exciting when you think about the kind of science and imagery we're likely to get. That's just a close-up of the rover working its way up inside the crevice. You can see there's a sort of a critical point at which you can't fold the wheels anymore and have them still get traction, but it's pretty small at this point, so it can really go into quite small areas and do some really amazing science. This is one of the later prototype models. They went to hard circuit boards on this one, but you can see it still has a certain amount of articulation. And you know, how soon these will be deployed, I don't know. We tend to launch missions to Mars every 2 to 4 years. I think if they do get these things ready to go, it'll probably be 2026, 2026, 2028 before it happens. But they're in development, and you know, I keep saying, the cool thing about it is they can basically go anywhere. So at this point, once we get these things running, nothing on Mars will be off limits to us. They're able to survive about a 15-foot fall in Martian gravity, we think, from the testing that's been done. And again, because at least on the earlier version, if they decide to use that configuration, if we use these fabric-based circuit boards, there is a small risk of these circuit traces cracking if they get articulated too many times, but they're flexible and really robust, so they have a good bounce factor. If you drop them or they run into something, no harm, no foul, they just keep going. Next story, bigger is better. So let's talk about space telescopes for a minute. Definitely the future of astronomy for a bunch of reasons. We've kind of reached the limits with large Earth-based telescopes. There's still things that you can do, and we'll make more advances. I think the big area of opportunity now is metamaterials, which have different characteristics that allow them to manipulate their focus with much more granularity than we can even with the multi-cell mirrors we have now to compensate for atmospherics, because as you know, as light's coming from space through the Earth's atmosphere, it's getting warped and twisted by refraction, and you start getting the point where things get very blurry. So there's been a lot of work done on that, but we can do better. So space telescopes are great because they're in orbit, or in the case of Webb, they're out at L2 beyond lunar orbit. So you no longer are looking through pollution in the atmosphere. Orbital debris or things like the Starlink satellites are not a problem because they're bedeviling Earth-based astronomers now by putting white streaks through everything they're trying to photograph. And you can do much better infrared and even UV astronomy because you don't have the atmosphere and the particulates in it interfering. So a project, and of course you're constrained in space telescopes by cost and launchability. That's the Webb on the left, as you all know. You know, this was a white knuckle flight. I'm sure you followed it. And there were so many things that had to go right, over 400 critical procedures. You had to unfold that heat shield down the bottom, which is 5 layers of very, very thin Kapton, a Mylar-like sheet. It has to be at just the right level of tautness. It has to have just the right shape once it's fully extended. Took all kinds of motors and latches and hinges and levers and things to make that work. And it was just a bit of a nightmare. So while we're glad Webb is working, and of course you had to unfold the main mirror, and they're still collimating that. Each of those mirror segments up in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not a hexagon, what would you call that? Anyway, the mirror shape is on an articulatable back with little motors in it. And when it was launched, of course, they were stowed against pins that kept them in one position. But as they're collimating this mirror, each of those mirror cells has to be lifted off the stowage pins about a 1/2 inch and angled in so that it's focused critically properly. And we're talking about micromotors here that take, I think, what did they say? It was going to take a week to move a 1/2 inch to get them into position to begin focusing and collimating. So it's a big hassle. If you could launch these things in one piece, that would be great. Now, once SpaceX gets their Starship flying, we've got a much bigger rocket fairing. Instead of being limited to about 15 feet like we are with rockets like the Falcon and the Falcon Heavy and the Atlas and so forth, now we've got a 30-foot cargo area, 30 feet in diameter, but you're still limited to that, right? So if you want to launch a one-piece telescope, you have a size constraint unless you're going to make it articulated. So how might we be able to get around this? Well, a group at JPL developed a technology called rotating synthetic aperture telescope, and it has a little bit of similarities to synthetic aperture radar, if you know anything about that. Basically, and this is the test unit. This is a camera lens off of an SLR, retail SLR looking at you. So that little white stripe is a tiny concave mirror. And once you select your image, your target in space, and this would of course be a much larger unit out there, you rotate this thing 180 degrees and you gather this series of images, which would actually be strips, not squares, but this is the illustration they gave me. And you assemble those with software. So you in effect have a synthetic aperture that's as big around in total size as the diameter of that little strip of glass or metal that you're using as your telescope optic. So in essence, if you had a 30-foot launch fairing, like you've got, or whatever the vertical measure, excuse me, is in Starship, that would be the diameter of the mirror in effect. So I hope this is making sense. Ultimately, this could lead to telescopes with an effective aperture of about 100 meters. For you taxpayers out there, which is most of us, I just want you to know this is tested with off-the-shelf components like a regular old SLR, but of course, in actual implementation, it'll be much larger and fancier. This is an image of the moon taken with the test unit. So on the left, you see the raw rotating aperture frame there. It's a little fuzzy when you first composite these images together, but the final image on the right after image processing is much better. Obviously, this is still in experimental phases. They've got a lot of work to do, but it's extremely promising and very exciting when you start thinking about what you could do with this. They'll cost less. They're launched as a single modular unit. You don't have a bunch of unfolding and articulating to do. And the amount of work, science work you're going to be able to do with this is really going to be incredible. Next story is smaller is better. We're talking about atomic clocks now. On your left there, you see JPL's newest atomic clock. Atomic clocks are really critical in spaceflight because timekeeping is critical. At this point, we control spacecraft one at a time from Earth, and it requires accuracy of about a billionth of a second, which you're not going to get from a stopwatch or a conventional electronic clock of some time. You need of some kind. You need an atomic clock. Having that billionth of a second accuracy will give you the ability to be accurate to within about a yard. And you can imagine when you're out 1 billion miles or so at Saturn, you want to be as accurate as possible because you don't want to go slamming into the rings instead of flying over them like Cassini did. And timing is really critical. So the current systems are large and power hungry, and they impose a lot of limitations on spacecraft design because every gram of mass that you spend on navigation and fuel and the spacecraft bus and everything else is a gram you can't use for science instrumentation. And the way we do it now also ties up the Deep Space Network. Here's a kind of a whimsical image of one of the dishes. I think it's the one in Australia. There's 3 stations around the world, equidistantly positioned so that we can cover the spacecraft at all times. But you're basically tracking and dealing with them one at a time. And when you've got dozens of these things out there flying together, it becomes a real traffic jam. So here's an Earth-based atomic clock, fairly recent. You can see the chassis on the right there. It's about the size of a refrigerator. They're big, they're heavy, they're power hungry. And frankly, they're just not going to fly even on something as large as a Cassini, which is about the size of a school bus. So for upcoming smaller spacecraft, you want something small. So JPL has been working on an atomic clock designed called a micromercury trapped atomic clock. And it's about that size. On the left, you've got a sugar cube. And on the right, you've got the new atomic clock. Now, we flew a new generation atomic clock about 7 years ago that was about the size of a torpedo. And it worked very well. It was a test project. But you can see they've come a long way in a short period of time. And the trend in spacecraft apparently is going to be moving towards much smaller, less expensive units and flying larger numbers of them for very tightly focused specific missions. And to do that, you're going to need something cheaper that requires less power and therefore less battery mass and smaller solar panels. And again, now you can carry more instrumentation. So this is kind of an exponential increase in efficiency for atomic clocks. It's pretty amazing. And it happens to be 1,000 times more accurate than the current model that's being used. So what that gets us is spacecraft that can travel further, do it less expensively, and operate longer and with more accuracy with less ground intervention. And for the technologists in the audience, I just added that line at the bottom. It's an optically pumped mercury ion inside a radio frequency field that's measured. And here's a schematic that I barely understand about how it works. Basically, got these mercury ions going back and forth, and you're able to measure them each time they pass this photomultiplier tube. Next story, finding the way. This continues our story of navigation in deep space, the outer solar system and beyond. Again, currently our robotic probes are all guided from Earth. It's very labor intensive. It's very expensive. It requires a lot of people, a lot of ground computing power, and ties up the deep space network, which is probably one of the biggest sins because there's just so much work that has to go through there. So what might be a better way? Well, they were thinking about, and by the way, when a spacecraft is out there, the way it gets its bearings relative to Earth is usually by using a star tracker. Canopus is a popular candidate. And that gives you, if you have a couple of star trackers, that allows you to stay oriented in addition to your other navigational assistance. But they wanted something that was reliable and a little easier to track. And by hook or by crook, they came up with the idea of using pulsars as lighthouses in space effectively. And these are, as I'm sure most of you know, rotating neutron stars that emit electromagnetic energy from their poles. And some of them, I mean, these things spin really fast. So there's a class called millisecond pulsars with these X-ray bursts coming out from each side. And if you can track those, now you've got this fixed position in space, and they're so far away, of course, there's no parallax issues. So you're able to use these things as navigational beacons. And if you have enough AI in the spacecraft, it can basically drive itself. And of course, AI, as it's infecting every other area of life that we live in, is becoming much more a part of robotic spaceflight, because the less ground control you need, the better. Because you get a spacecraft out at the range of, say, Saturn, you know, you've got a couple of hours before the round trip's completed, at least, for the commands to go out and back. So more than a couple, I should say. So the more AI you can carry on board, the better. And as that increasingly is miniaturized, and now you've got these fixed spots in space that you can look at to use in navigation, these things can become largely self-operating. The technology for this, again, just to keep costs down, was derived from an existing instrument on the Perseverance rover called the Pixel. It's an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, and they basically just took an unused spare piece that they built for the rover, because you build backups for most of the instrumentation in case something fails before it launches, and use that for this experiment. So it's very, very cool. This is the actual guts of the thing. It's called the polycapillary device. And that little thing that looks like an onion or the doomsday machine, depending on how you look at it, in the middle of that illustration there, if you can see my cursor, is comprised of millions of strands of glass, fiber optics. And so you take the incoming energy from an X-ray source and they concentrate them down to a small target where they can be measured. And it gets into a lot of arcane mathematics that are beyond my pay grade about how the X-ray energy bounces around inside this glass channel. But at the end of the day, it comes out the back end and is measurable and allows you to stay locked on your pulsars. So you've got good guidance all the way through deep space. This is just an illustration that we used of a potential light sail using a beam going out to a pulsar that looks way too close to be realistic. But the net result that everybody loves is that these things are effectively self-navigating for long periods of time. Sorry, I missed the title slide here. Our next story is called Dragnet. And this is a more efficient way to break spacecraft into planetary and lunar orbits. As you know, you got to carry a lot of fuel to power your braking rocket to get your spacecraft to slow down when you arrive somewhere. So like we see, if you're a fan of The Expanse, you accelerate halfway to where you're going, and then you decelerate halfway. So if you're heading out to Mars or Jupiter or even the moon, you've got to break into orbit, and it takes a lot of fuel to do that. So here's an example. Mariner 7's on the upper left, Mariner 9's the lower right. Mariner 7 was a flyby Mars mission. Mariner 9 had to go into orbit. Mariner 7 weighed 908 pounds. Mariner 9 weighed 2,200 pounds, most of that being propellant. So it's extremely heavy. The propellant you have to carry is extremely heavy and, of course, limited. So is there a better way? Well, for decades now, we've been using aerobraking to some extent, but aerobraking on the spacecraft that they've been using it on is very tricky and takes a really long time. So here's the Mars Global Surveyor, which is an early example of aerobraking being used at Mars. And you aim it sufficiently close to the planet that as it scoots by, it dips just far enough in the atmosphere to create some drag and slow down. But you got to be very careful, because if you go down a little bit further than you intended, those solar panels are going to snap off and other problems are going to occur. And that actually, there were some issues with Mars Global Surveyor, although it did survive. So it's been used now at Mars and Venus. But what if there was an easier way to do this that was more foolproof and didn't need as much course correction? Because while you're doing these aerobraking maneuvers, you are burning course correction propellant like mad to try and keep the thing properly oriented so it gets maximum drag with minimum damage. And it's a very, very concise ballet you have to do. And mind you, newer probes are getting smaller and smaller. This is a small sat, but as we get smaller, it's going to be easier to do this, except that they're so small, they don't create enough drag to really be effective, even though their mass is lower. So they needed a way to create more drag. So we currently have 24 probes in operation throughout the solar system. Some are large, and they're all expensive. And as I keep saying, we want to do this smaller. So here's Cassini, and here is kind of roughly in scale the size of where we want to go. And with the miniaturized sensory instrumentation they've got now, you can actually get almost the same science return from this little guy as you did from this massive machine 20 years ago. So the trick here is to have a deployable drag skirt, which is basically a big umbrella that unfolds. So as you get into the atmosphere, it maximizes drag. And because it's of a uniform shape, it's stable. You don't have to burn a bunch of maneuvering propellant to keep it stable as you're going through the atmosphere. It tends to just want to go in that one direction that it's going. And it slows it down a lot faster because you're now able to dip deeper in the atmosphere, and you're able to get more drag because of the size of that, that drag shield. And you can reach your science orbit a lot quicker, which is, of course, what everybody wants. We don't want to keep waiting around to get where we want to go. So for anybody who's interested, this will be coming out probably in March. Print versions are hard to get your hands on because they only print a limited version of them for government use. but the full report will be online. I don't know the exact URL, but if you Google JPL technology highlights, you'll be able to find books from the last 7 years, I think. And as I said, this one should be up in March. So I want to thank you. And down at the bottom there is my website, pylebooks.com. I'm starting a new podcast in about 6 weeks called This Week in Space on the Premier Radio Networks.